We've got two tangential issues to wrestle with. The one that broke last night, the story that broke last night was Israel raiding the Qatari based Al Jazeera TV network's offices in Jerusalem in the Ambassador Hotel yesterday, confiscating equipment. Benjamin Netanyahu accusing Al Jazeera of actively participating in the October 7th massacre and inciting against IDF soldiers. And you may say, well, why does this matter to me here in the UK? And the answer, it does matter to you, because even if you don't watch or read the content that Al Jazeera produces, because foreign journalists are banned by the Israeli government from entering Gaza, so much for a free press, we have actually been very reliant on Al Jazeera as our eyes and ears during the war. That is not to say that Al Jazeera hasn't platformed some pretty reprehensible characters with some very anti-Semitic anti-Semitic views. There's no doubt about it. And then the story moves on slightly further. That arrived at LBC at dawn this morning to hear that the much talked about attack on Rafah is to go ahead. This is despite huge efforts by Joe Biden and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to push for a ceasefire, but those ceasefire talks appear to have crumbled. And despite the fact that 1.4 million people are currently in Rafah, 22,000 people per square kilometre, which is hugely dense. If it is good news, what we've heard this morning is that only around 100,000 of those, so fewer than 10%, are being told to move because they're close to the border, a border from which rocket attacks rained down on Israel yesterday, killing 3 soldiers, I believe. The trouble is, of course, is that many of those refugees, if not all of them, were told by the IDF to move to Rafah in the first place. So they've got less and less territory, less and less ground to exist on. Well, joining me first to discuss, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course, ladies and gentlemen, 0345 606 0973, your thoughts on Al Jazeera, your thoughts on the IDF moving in on Rafah. But I'm going to turn first for guidance to Aidan White, an honorary advisor to the Fetisov Journalism Awards and president of the Ethical Journalism Network, former general secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Good morning to you, Aidan.
Good morning.
I've been reading quite a lot from foreign correspondents who are concerned about the closure of Al Jazeera. The fact that Al Jazeera has also platformed those with anti-Semitic views kind of gives Netanyahu carte blanche to close them down, do you think?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think any action taken against media in these circumstances has to be justified. There has to be clear evidence that Al Jazeera has acted as it's accused of active participation in the war, and that's a nonsense. Any journalist who has been covering these terrible events over the past months will know that Al Jazeera has been scrupulously honest and professional in its work. It has not been a place for hate speech. It has not been inciting violence. It's tried recognizing that it faces the threat constantly and its staff have been attacked on the ground, that it actually has to keep its nose clean and has done so very well. And that's why so many people are very shocked by the attack on Al Jazeera, and it's seen by most journalists as a desperate act by the Israeli government and really just an act of blatant censorship without any justification at all.
What does it mean for global knowledge of what's going on in Gaza and what's to come in Gaza, because Rafah is very much in the front of my mind as we're having this conversation, because it is fair to say that Al Jazeera journalists have acted very much as the eyes and ears of the world in recent months.
Well, I mean, I think that this role has not been one they wanted. They wanted to be like other journalists, to be able to go freely and to report freely on what's going on. The reality of it is that the Israeli government and its defense forces are engaged in a very formal system of control of journalism and access to information. They're trying to control the message that gets to the outside world. So, for example, Palestinian journalists inside Gaza have suffered terribly trying to report on the event. More than 100 of them have been killed already. foreign journalists are not allowed access at all to Gaza, including Israeli journalists. So Israel is very much controlling who goes in and who goes out, and the messages that go out. And it's clear that its actions against Al Jazeera are much more to do with the fact that Al Jazeera is providing information that the outside world needs to know, and is providing information that, frankly, Israel would prefer would remain secret.
Very troubling. It is. How would you characterise the relationship, Aidan, between a healthy democracy and a free press? Because Israel is very much about promoting the notion of being a healthy democracy, but its views of the press are very different from ours.
Yeah. I think it's very difficult to sustain the idea that Israel and its actions over the last 6 months in Gaza and the West Bank constitute the actions of a credible and viable democracy. Israel stands accused of testing humanitarian law over acts of genocide to the very limit. It's accused over killing of innocent civilians, including the targeting of journalists. There have been numerous incidents of alleged war crimes, and previous warnings, returning to the issues in Gaza this morning, previous warnings and promises of civilian population to move safely to places where they can be secure have actually turned to nothing. And we've seen civilians attacked and killed even when they've been on their way to so-called areas of safety. So this idea of Israel as a democracy is frankly very, very difficult to sustain at this moment, given the evidence over the past months.
Aidan White, lovely talking to you. Thank you, former General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. I'm turning now to Richard Pater, Director of the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. If I may start first backwards, if I may, and start with the situation in Rafah. What do you understand is going on there at the moment?
So my understanding is, as a result of Hamas' failure in terms of what was seen as, by the Americans at least, as a very generous offer by the Israelis in terms of trying to reach a short-term ceasefire and a release of some of the hostages, in a failure of Hamas's obtuse position, Israel seems to be carrying out the first stage of its much-talked-about operation into Rafah. And that first stage, which is likely to last a few weeks, begins with the evacuation of the civilian population, because it's clear from the IDF perspective there is just distinction between the terrorists and the civilians that should be unharmed.
Can you help us with why only 100,000 people or thereabouts have been asked to move out of a refugee population of about 1.4 million?
I think this is just the first stage. I imagine that there will be much more moved later on, but my understanding is the first part, it's referring to the eastern part of Rafah, and most importantly, the border area between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and what the Israelis refer to as the Philadelphia corridor. And I think that corridor, which has been the site of much of the arms and weapons smuggling by Hamas from Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, is one of the major objectives of this operation, to prevent Hamas in the long term from rearming.
Okay, that's helpful. Where does this leave the fate of the surviving hostages? That we've seen all the demonstrations in Israel by friends, relatives and others are concerned. As far as I understand, that however obtuse the Hamas ceasefire offer was, it did involve the release of hostages as well as Palestinian prisoners, up to 33, I think, at a time. Netanyahu pushing for going into Rafah doesn't seem to do anything to help the hostages.
So there are two parallel processes here. As I said, the first, that the optimum choice by the Israelis would be to reach an agreement, to reach an understanding that would result in, at the first stage at least, one hopes 33 hostages that are still alive to be released in return for hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are unrepentant murderers. But that's the price that Israel is prepared to pay.
Some of them, of course, may be unconvicted children, which is one of the things we've heard, isn't it? People are locked up without conviction some of the time.
I don't think that's the case. I think everyone there goes through due process and through trial. That's the nature of the system here. But in any case, Hamas seems to be objecting to this deal. Sinwar, leader of Hamas, and lots of analysts that I've heard from just think that he just is unrepentant and isn't looking to do a deal, that the hostages remain his best insurance policy.
And I'd be neglectful if I didn't ask you as well on your thoughts on Israel closing down Al Jazeera, which, despite my conversation with Aidan, it goes back a while. I mean, you'd be talking pre-2016, 2017. They did platform proper anti-Semites. I mean, no doubt about it, they did. I will accept that Aidan's view that during the war, since the war, they've played a keener, more balanced game. Should it be shut down?
Well, I think calling Al Jazeera balanced is quite a stretch. I'd also say that there is a quality difference between the English version, which is far more sanitized, which your audience may be hearing, and the Arabic version. Either way, both channels are Hamas supporting incitement to terrorism, but that's not why they've been shut down. They've been shut down very specifically because they are a threat to Israeli national security. And they haven't released exactly why, but I can speculate on 3 or 4 reasons of what Al Jazeera has done in the past that could suggest that it warrants being shut down. And that includes their journalists, inverted commas, taking part in the October 7th, or documenting it as part of the...
I mean, I've got to be very careful here, because we heard the Israeli allegations against UNRWA, and so far, where are we now, 4 months on, no actual proof has come from Israel. So we've got to be cautious about speculation. We need to deal with facts. But let's parking out Al Jazeera for just a moment. You don't allow foreign journalists into Gaza. So how can the world assess the things that you say to be true if we can't see? That's what journalism, free press is about.
I'm with you. I support the entrance of international media. I think that is important. I think that will come in time as well. Right now, it's quite clear that hasn't been possible because we're dealing about a very complex war zone that would endanger journalists going in. And we also understand how Hamas have manipulated foreign journalists and threatened them while they've been working inside in the past. I believe it will come. I believe it will be very welcome to have international
if it
media
comes, with respect, Richard, if it comes after the ground after Rafah is bombed, there's not going to be a lot left of Gaza for them to actually report on. The war will be over. Richard Pater, lovely talking to you. And I really respect the fact that, despite the fact we may have different views about the situation in Gaza, there is a call there from Richard for a free press, for a press response, for a press presence, rather, in Israel.